Wow, even have the dogs greeting me. Thank you, Shelley, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the Old Bridgewater Historical Society for hosting me here this evening. And thank you most of all to everyone who has come out tonight to support the Society's mission in preserving local history and to learn a little bit, I hope, about Bridgewater State Farm and its troubled past. And its past has been troubled. Now, many histories could be written about the institution that today is known as the Bridgewater Correctional Complex, previously was known as the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Bridgewater, and prior to that, the Massachusetts State Farm at Bridgewater. But the history that I've chosen to write, and the one that I want to share with you here a little bit tonight, has to do with the evolution of that institution. Bridgewater was established in 1852 as a poorhouse for the state, and it was established in a great spirit of optimism and hope. This was a great era of social reform in Massachusetts where social reformers and politicians thought that anything was possible and we could address social ills in society. But by the 1930s, Bridgewater had become notorious for its treatment of inmates and patients. And in the 1960s and the 1970s, it was considered one of the worst prisons, if not the worst prison in the nation, and one of the worst psychiatric hospitals, if not the worst psychiatric hospital in the nation. And there has been a general consensus about Bridgewater and the troubles that it has had. In 2016, the Boston Globe, which is admittedly liberal in its outlook, termed Bridgewater State Hospital, which is part of the institution there, it termed Bridgewater State Hospital a moral stain. In 2017, our Republican governor looked back at the historic results of Bridgewater, and he termed them disastrous in many cases. So there has been a consensus about Bridgewater's past, in that it has arrived at a destination that we never intended. And this, despite all the best intentions of the good people that have worked at Bridgewater and continue to work at Bridgewater, trying to create a better life for the inmates and the patients there. So the question is, how did this come about? How did we end up in a destination that we never intended? So as I said, Bridgewater was established not as a psychiatric hospital, not as a prison, but as a poorhouse or an almshouse for the state. It was established back in 1852. Now, at the time it was established, Massachusetts was a center of social reform, not only in the nation, but in the world, that governments throughout the U.S., throughout the world, looked to Massachusetts as a leader in providing charitable relief and charitable institutions to its residents and its citizens. Massachusetts sought to address the social ills which it saw. And among the two most important ones that it looked to address were homelessness and poverty. In the wake of the Revolutionary War, there is a tremendous increase in what are known as the unsettled poor. These are individuals, paupers as they were known at the time, who did not have any legal residence in any one community or no legal settlement. And because of that, they would roam from community to community. And this was considered a social blight and a big social problem. The numbers of the unsettled poor increased in the early 1800s, such to a point that it became a concern for social reformers. And one of the social reformers that was concerned about the rise of the unsettled poor was Josiah Quincy. Now, Quincy at the time was a Massachusetts congressman. He would later serve as mayor of Boston. It is actually for him that we get the name Quincy Market. He would still later serve as president of Harvard. But in the early 1820s, he became concerned about the rise of the unsettled poor. Because again, these individuals who could not claim residence in any community, that meant they could not claim relief from any community. Towns were obligated to provide relief in the form usually of an almshouse or a poor farm, but without that legal residence in these towns, these individuals could not take advantage of it. So they would wander from community to community looking for jobs, looking for shelter, looking for food. And many times when they couldn't find that, they were forced to beg. And so that this was conceived or perceived as a great social problem that needed to be addressed. Now, Quincy's solution was the establishment of an almshouse. He felt that the Commonwealth needed to take responsibility for these individuals, and he felt that they could do that through the establishment of an almshouse. So eventually action is taken on his suggestion. In 1852, the Commonwealth does establish not just one almshouse, but a system of 3 almshouses. There's an almshouse that is established at Munson in western Massachusetts. There's one that is established at Tewksbury, and then there is the third established nearby in Bridgewater. It is felt at the time that this institution will be able to solve the problem of the unsettled poor, that it will be able to provide relief and constructively address social ills that we have here in Massachusetts. But immediately the wheels come off and this dream collapses. And there are many reasons for this. And these reasons will weave their way through Bridgewater's history up until the present day. One of the first reasons is the physical facility itself. This is actually Bridgewater, an engraving of the original almshouse and what it looked like. The building is built to the lowest habitable standard. It is felt that the people that are going to be seeking relief and living in this building do not deserve better, and that is the mindset at the time. So it is built to the lowest habitable standard. During the first storm, slates blow off the roof and the roof leaks for years. There's no potable water on site. Water has to be drawn from the Taunton River, and particularly after the 1870s, it is increasingly polluted by industrial discharges upstream as well as sewage. Worst of all, it is wood frame construction throughout. Obviously not material conducive to fire prevention. The third superintendent of Bridgewater will actually call the building a poorly constructed old wooden fire trap. And this will have repercussions in 1883, as we'll see in a bit. Now, the challenge of building to the lowest habitable standard and the concept of good enough, that this building, the facility, is good enough for the individuals, it begins to reinforce a perception of the folks that will be seeking relief there, the unsettled poor, as second-class citizens and as social outcasts, that they are not wanted in society, so let's send them to Bridgewater. Let's get them out of our communities and out of our towns. And that is reinforced by the notion of good enough. The location that's chosen is Bridgewater, but the location is 4 miles south of the center of Bridgewater. Essentially, it's in the middle of nowhere between the center of Bridgewater and the center of Middleborough. A later superintendent, Blackstone, who I mentioned, he described it as 4 miles back in the woods. Now, it's chosen because it's on the main railroad line between Fall River and Boston, so it's felt that it will be easy to transport paupers there, and it will be economical. But others saw this as a way to segregate these inmates away from society. These almshouses were built, as one critic described, a 2-day horse ride from 19th century society. And the location of Bridgewater reinforces this notion, and you begin to see Bridgewater as a place that's not only geographically separate, but morally and sociologically separate as well. Now, Bridgewater is intended for the relief of the urban and the rural poor, but soon you get other classifications in there. Bridgewater becomes filled with immigrants, largely Irish immigrants. It is filled with chronically ill. It is filled with the acutely ill. It is beginning to be filled with the mentally disturbed. And this makes it a challenge to administer Bridgewater effectively, and administrators will struggle with this for years. Bridgewater, although it's a charitable institution, is operated like a penal institution. Life in the almshouse is very regimented. A bell rings at or before dawn to wake the prisoners. A bell rings 15 minutes before breakfast, 45 minutes before lunch, again 15 minutes before supper, and at 9 o'clock when all inmates are expected to extinguish their lights. Upon rising, the inmates are allowed to wash their face and comb their hair, but change clothes, shaves, baths are all at the discretion of the superintendent. Visits are at the superintendent's discretion. There is a fence that goes around the perimeter of the almshouse, and the inmates are kept in there. That if an inmate left, which was not an option, it would be considered that they were escaping. So it operates very much like a prison. The inmates were put to work on the farm, and from the very beginning, the almshouse did include a farm. Now, the inmates that were in the almshouse, and they were referred to as inmates, were put to work if they were able-bodied. But because many of them were old and infirm, they couldn't work on the farm. But those that could did so. And you can see below, it's also in the corner there as well, too, a diagram of the farm from 1862. For inmates who refused to work on the farm, though, there was punishment, what they called exemplary punishment, which could be a diet of bread and water, or it could be solitary confinement. Worst of all was the life of families who sought relief in the almshouse. Families would be separated. Fathers would be sent to one ward, mothers to a second ward, children to a third ward, and families were separated. Immediately, the almshouse is perceived as not a happy place. It's a negative place. Not only do the inmates feel that, but outside public views begin to reinforce that as well. It's referred to as the perils of Bridgewater, one critic calls it. Another critic, very much understated, refers to Bridgewater as a most unpalatable place. Bridgewater becomes perceived as a place where people go to die. And this is not helped by the mortality rate. The mortality rate in 1858, just 4 years after Bridgewater opened, is 1 in 8. So for every 8 individuals going to seek relief in the almshouse, 1 would actually perish. And so the almshouse is perceived as a place that is not successful. It is not able to rehabilitate and provide a better life for the unsettled poor. As early as 1859, just 5 years after the institution opens, it's declared a failure. In his inaugural address in 1859, Governor Nathaniel P. Banks, who is the gentleman here, declares Bridgewater and the almshouse system as a whole as a partial if it does not prove an entire failure. So 5 years into this experiment, it's declared a failure. Ironically, it's not because Bridgewater is not able to effectively rehabilitate or provide relief for the unsettled poor, which it's not able to do, but it's because the institution is not self-supporting. This becomes a yardstick by which the success of the almshouse is measured. That in Massachusetts, we want to provide relief to the poor as long as it doesn't cost us anything. So what you begin to see is the cost of this, and it's measured the success of the almshouse based upon the cost. So what that leads to is an overhaul of the almshouse system. In 1866, the 3 almshouses are overhauled. Munson becomes an educational facility for pauper children. It's thought best to remove the children from the negative, unconstructive environment of the workhouse, so they are sent to Munson. Tewksbury becomes an almshouse for what are known as the honest poor. This is a stereotypical widow who has lost her husband. She has no children to support her. There obviously is no Social Security at the time. Social insurance is just coming into popularity. She has come to her poverty through no error of her own. She is the honest poor, and Tewksbury will remain an almshouse for the honest poor. Bridgewater becomes a workhouse for vicious paupers. Now, a couple words about that. A workhouse is more severe than an almshouse. In a workhouse, you will be put to work. You are expected to work to earn your keep. You are expected to work because somehow you are in that almshouse because of vice. We'll talk about that momentarily. But you are in there because of something you did and you need to be punished. So you will be sent to the workhouse as punishment. Now, the word vicious has a different connotation today than it did then. In those days, it was simply someone or somebody or something related to vice. So what happens is Bridgewater becomes a workhouse for vicious paupers, for people who are poor because they engaged in vice. These are alcoholics. These are homeless individuals. They are prostitutes, petty thieves, drug abusers, other misdemeanors. They are criminals, and they are being sent to Bridgewater. And Bridgewater will keep this focus on vicious paupers and on petty criminals up through much of its history and up to the mid-1900s. You'll begin to see these types of individuals sent to Bridgewater. Now, the main 2 classifications that Bridgewater focused on were homeless individuals and chronic alcoholics. Both of those, homelessness and alcoholism, were criminalized at the time. Homelessness was criminalized as vagrancy. Alcoholism was criminalized as drunkenness or public drunkenness. And both of those remain criminalized in Massachusetts up until the 1970s, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, that those 2 issues were considered crimes. And Bridgewater will concern itself with those 2 crimes of alcoholism and homelessness through much of its history, all the way up until the 1970s. The main issue that it dealt with was alcoholism. For chronic alcoholics, their alcoholism was not seen as a medical issue or an addiction. It was seen as a social vice. Alcoholics could be convicted of drunkenness and sent to Bridgewater for terms of up to 2 years. At this time, the temperance movement, moralists within the communities, other reformers felt that having drunks in the community is not good. Let's get them off the streets, and we're going to send them to Bridgewater. And at Bridgewater, they receive no help whatsoever. There is no medical treatment for them. They are just simply put into Bridgewater as punishment. Bridgewater, the population there, about 75% after 1866, are chronic alcoholics that are sent to Bridgewater. Not too much different was the plight of the homeless. If you were homeless, you could be convicted of vagrancy. There was a great increase in homelessness in the 1870s in Massachusetts. There was a depression that came about in 1873. It was the worst depression prior to the Great Depression. It lasted through most of the 1870s, and a lot of individuals were homeless, not only because of the depression, but they were disabled, they could not find work, they lost their homes. There was a thought that New Hampshire's vagrancy laws were much stricter. And so you begin to get this concept that these evil people are crossing our borders and bringing bad things with them, and something you still hear today. So there was a push in Massachusetts to strengthen the vagrancy laws. And Massachusetts does that. So in 1880, it passes what is known as the Tramp Law. And it's actually referred to as an act for the protection of the people of the Commonwealth against tramps. So you can see by the tone and the name of that act what it was designed to do, that it was meant to protect citizens from tramps who are seen as an evil influence. What the law does, it provides terms of up to 2 years, again, in the workhouse for people that are convicted of vagrancy, and they could be sent there. And the vagrants are the largest classification outside of alcoholics that are sent to Bridgewater, and they will continue to be sent to Bridgewater for decades. Now, in addition to the honest poor who are still at Bridgewater, because Tewksbury has problems, it has problems with overcrowding, so it tries to send some of its honest poor to Bridgewater, you get these petty criminals. But you also begin to get mentally ill individuals that start finding their way into the workhouse. Now, Massachusetts at the time had 5 asylums, as they were called. Worcester opened in the 1830s, followed by Taunton, and then there was Danvers, Northampton, and Westboro. These are institutions that are meant for the care of the mentally ill. But these institutions begin to see in Bridgewater a way to offload more troublesome patients. So if you were mentally ill in the asylum, but maybe you were difficult to manage, maybe you were violent, you could be sent to Bridgewater, and these institutions start doing that. And so at Bridgewater, the mentally ill receive no treatment whatsoever. They are just sent there, and now you begin to get mentally ill in the institution, criminals in the institution, or people that are judged to be criminals, as well as the honest poor. You begin to get a mixture of classifications, which makes Bridgewater a very difficult institution to manage. There is no treatment for any of these individuals. What happens to them is they are put to work. They are put to work on the farm. It is thought by social reformers, politicians, that good, hard, honest labor will teach people a good work ethic or a strong work ethic. It will prevent them from being confirmed in their ways, particularly those folks that are judged criminals. We don't want them falling into bad habits, so let's put them to work on the farm. Not only was farm work available, but there was also indoor industrial employment. So people might be put to work making baskets, doing the cane seating of chairs. And again, the thought was that this type of labor would teach the inmates of Bridgewater habits of industry, and it would turn them around in their ways. With a mixed classification facility like Bridgewater and what Bridgewater was becoming, it becomes very difficult to maintain discipline. It becomes very difficult to maintain order. And in 1874, you begin to get the first serious allegations of mistreatment of inmates and patients that will remain up until the current day. In 1874, it's alleged that an attendant kicks an inmate to death for simply concealing a slice of bread in his uniform sleeve for a snack between meals. 3 years later, the Boston Pilot repeats these allegations and says a different attendant abused an inmate there. And so there are challenges, and there are thoughts that there are some attendants there that are abusive to the inmates and to the patients. Now, the administrators come out, and they're backed by a legislative investigation that says these charges are somewhat overblown. The administrators come out and say, not only are they overblown, but the inmates are better fed and better clothed than most residents of Massachusetts. This just sets the conservative critics off, who say that the people that are in here are taking advantage of the state's welfare, that they are seeking relief, and that they do not deserve it. And again, this is a mindset that is still prevalent today. The inmates themselves would have disagreed about the comforts that Bridgewater supposedly offered. They show their dissatisfaction by escaping. Escapes are definitely a monthly occurrence, if not a near weekly occurrence. At that time, it was a workhouse. The guards are not armed. You could escape off of the farm. It was somewhat easy to do. These escapes are known as elopements. They are also known as taking leg bail. The most serious example of inmate dissatisfaction with the institution happens on July 1883, when one inmate sets fire to the single almshouse building. The fire is discovered in the morning in the attic of the building, and it spreads with what is described as inconceivable rapidity. Within 15 minutes, that one almshouse building is all aflame. The pumper Usamaquin is dispatched from the School Street Firehouse, seen here in Bridgewater, but the horse dies on the way to the fire. And the firemen have to pull the pumper the rest of the way. So you can guess when they got to the almshouse had been pretty much destroyed. There was nothing left. Inmates simply sat on the grass in the field and watched it burn. Now, in the wake of the fire, the newly appointed superintendent, Hollis Blackstone, he had the misfortune of actually being appointed about a week prior to this. 3 days later, he does not know how many inmates have escaped. They began to recapture some of them, and one of the ones that they recapture is James Gilmore, who admits to setting the fire because of the way he was treated at Bridgewater. And this reinforces the thought that Bridgewater can at times be a brutal institution. At his trial, Gilmore said he carried a match 1 year to accomplish it, and I am glad the damn place is in ashes. He is subsequently tried, and he is given 20 years for the crime of arson. Now, the almshouse is rebuilt, and it's rebuilt as a series of fireproof buildings, and they are rebuilt as separate buildings. The workhouse, rather, opens back up in December 1884 when 127 inmates are brought back to Bridgewater handcuffed in pairs, and the institution reopens. Now, shortly after it reopened in 1884, it is renamed, and it is renamed the State Farm, the Massachusetts State Farm. And it is felt, because there still are honest paupers living there, that these are people who have come to poverty through no fault of their own, that in deference to them, let's call this something else. So it's called the State Farm. But Superintendent Blackstone has an issue with that, because what he will say, and it's true, that that name of State Farm does not truly convey the roles of this institution. It does not convey that it still works as an almshouse for the honest poor, that is now a penal institution for petty criminals, for the vicious poor, and it's increasingly a mental institution, that it is increasingly an asylum. Because what happens is Benjamin Butler, who is the governor, not a very attractive man, obviously, he is quite notorious, but in 1886, at his suggestion, Bridgewater begins taking in what is known as the harmless insane. These are individuals who are suffering from mental illness but are not violent, are not criminal. And so in 1887, Bridgewater opens an asylum building for the harmless insane. This is the building here. It actually no longer stands at Bridgewater. But Bridgewater begins to take in these individuals, and the administrators, oddly enough, are okay with this, because Bridgewater was challenged to reduce its operating costs, and the mentally ill were seen as a way to do that. With paupers, you couldn't have them out in the fields because many of them were disabled or infirm, and they couldn't work. The criminals you couldn't trust not to escape while out in the fields. So the thought was, we will put the mentally ill to work in the fields. Now, the harmless insane are joined in 1896 by the criminal insane when an asylum for insane criminals is opened, and this is renamed Bridgewater State Hospital in 1919. This begins to create problems because even though you have different departments, you'll have a prison department and now you're getting an asylum department, you begin to mix the harmless insane with what are judged as the criminally insane. In 1897, there are 212 criminal insane, and they are housed alongside 88 harmless insane. There is no treatment that is provided for the individuals that are suffering from mental illness. Staffing is limited, and when you look at the salaries of the institution, the superintendent, the director of the farm, the head of the farm, the cooks, the matrons, they all receive salaries that are more than the medical director. And that somewhat shows you the emphasis or lack of emphasis that Bridgewater placed on this. It also raises the issue in terms of the criminally insane being mixed with the harmless insane, because now you have individuals that are placed in an institution intended for criminals that are not criminal. They were not convicted of a crime. In 1915, the Board of Insanity, the Massachusetts Board of Insanity, estimates that 1/3 of the individuals that are in the asylum do not deserve to be there, that they should be in the state's mental hospitals at that point. And this will become a long-standing issue of people being incarcerated that should not necessarily be in this institution. The prison department, which I skimmed by, the prison department is also overcrowded, and it also suffers from challenges. Largely, it is overcrowding because courts are very aggressive about convicting people of public drunkenness and sending them to this institution. Again, about 3/4 of the population of Bridgewater are convicted as drunkards. They are alcoholics who are suffering and who do not receive any relief here. Alcoholics, as I said, do not receive treatment at Bridgewater, but they are released after they serve their term. What they happen to do at that point is they reoffend because they go back out into society and they struggle without any type of support. In Bridgewater, about 60% of the folks that are convicted as alcoholics had seen previous terms there. And there are instances of individuals who saw up to 27 terms in Bridgewater being convicted of basically alcoholism. Overcrowding, like I said, was worsened by a tendency of courts to convict and to convict quickly. There were some courts that wanted to get these folks just off the streets. The Boston municipal courts became notorious for convicting people. But in their defense, there was a huge number that would pass through the courts in Boston on a daily basis for drunkenness, and only a small percentage was sent to Bridgewater, but it was still overwhelming for Bridgewater. Bridgewater would see up to 4,000 individuals convicted at peak years on an annual basis as alcoholics. Again, the principal means of occupying these individuals was the farm, and it would remain so through the 1900s. The farm was an enormous undertaking, and all of the individuals that were there, as many as they could, were put to work. As many as 17 horse teams and 9 ox teams daily would be put out in the fields. The Massachusetts State Archives has all the farm books, and every single day it was recorded exactly what these teams were doing, what they were engaged in, what the harvest looked like, and it was an enormous undertaking. Haying in particular was enormous. In 1905, it took 300 inmates and 25 carts to mechanically mow 1,100 acres of standing grass. It was a huge operation. You can still see that today with the expanse of the fields. And here you can see the prison on the right-hand side. Despite the emphasis on farm work, there was still indoor industrial employment, largely confined to the cane seating of chairs, which you see here. And that was largely for legal reasons that they did that. An interesting thing about this image, I find this image particularly striking because you see many of the men are turned away from the camera, but many of the men have their hand on the lower portion of their face. They are not resting. This shows the stigma of this institution. They did not want to be photographed. They are concealing their faces as much as they can. So these are probably men who were convicted of petty crimes. Again, they could be alcoholics, and drunkenness was a crime at that point. They could be vagrants, and this clearly shows the stigma that these inmates felt at being in this institution. Surviving correspondence from the period speaks very much about operational challenges which the institution had, but less discussed is the issues that it had in terms of maintaining discipline and maintaining morale. One of the most important factors in morale was food. The menu from 1905, from June 30th, 1905, was typical. But it is surprising because of the amount of physical labor that these men were expected to do. It is surprising how little they were actually fed. For that day, breakfast was corned beef hash, bread and tea. Lunch was baked beans and bread, and supper was applesauce, bread, and tea. So it was very limited. It was comparable to what the other institutions saw, so Charlestown State Prison, Deer Island, but for folks that were meant to go out into the fields and labor physically all day, it was the bare minimum. Now, to serve the needs of the prison population, they needed to have a large staff. The census that was taken in March 1900, besides Superintendent Blackstone, talk about a medical director, 4 physicians, 4 nurses, but only 12 attendants or guards. There was a matron, there was a cook. And here you can kind of see some of the individuals. These photos are actually from an album from the Massachusetts State Archives that one of the attendants, the lady here with kind of the dark skirt and the glasses, her husband took. And it speaks to the family kind of quality that the workers had, that they did create a community because they were all there with the best intents to create better lives for the inmates that were in that institution. Now, they were provided perks in terms of housing. This is a male attendant's housing at Bridgewater, had a bowling alley in the basement, so it was definitely considered at least good benefits with it, but it was low paying, and we'll see that in a moment when we talk about the attendants, that they were not very well paid. But the superintendent was provided a house, which is still there, next to the entrance, and the medical director was also provided a house by the Commonwealth. For those officers that were not provided housing, they did build their own. This is Blackstone Square, later known as Alden Square, right off of Ticket Street. None of the houses except for one on the corner still exist, and there's one behind it, and they were demolished by the Commonwealth. But again, the officers of the institution created this residential enclave right outside the prison, and they did stress the community that they did have. Now, at this time, not only were the officers building and expanding, but the prison was expanding itself. During the late 1800s, particularly the 1890s and the early 1900s, the prison expands greatly. Here on the right-hand side, you can see the prison building with the 3 cone-shaped towers. The towers are still there, the roofs are gone, but this was meant because of the overcrowding that was seen, this was meant to relieve it. Because again, the courts are still very aggressive about sending vagrants and what they call drunkards to Bridgewater and filling it up, and they needed more space. Bridgewater eventually covers acres of ground, and you can see the sprawling complex that it actually was at one time. And this is actually before construction happened on the right side of the screen, with the tower building being built and then other buildings being built a little bit later. So Bridgewater actually became much larger than we will see here. Now, despite all of this, and the challenges that Bridgewater had, and the challenges it had with periodic allegations of cruelty, and the challenges it had rehabilitating the inmates and rehabilitating alcoholics and homeless individuals, it still was considered, for the most part, a well-run institution. There were governments elsewhere, the government of Ohio, as well as a commission from Great Britain, sent folks to examine Bridgewater and see what insight they could learn. So it was considered relatively well-managed, but this would soon change. In 1919, the institution is moved from the jurisdiction of the Board of Charity to the Bureau of Prisons, and that signals its final move from a charitable institution to a penal institution. So in 1919, Bridgewater State Farm is taken on by the Bureau of Prisons. Now, the largest classification that remains at Bridgewater still during this period of the early 1900s are the alcoholics that are sent here convicted of public drunkenness. But there is a change in the mindset of the Commonwealth at this time, and there is a change in society that begins to perceive alcoholism as a medical issue and less as a social issue. So there is a thought that maybe these individuals should not be convicted as being criminals. They still are, but there are less and less of them every year that are being sent to Bridgewater. There are alternatives that are looked for them in terms of treatment outside of Bridgewater. But they do still remain the largest classification. The second classification that we see, besides the criminals, are the criminally insane. The criminally insane are the most troubled of the inmates at Bridgewater. They are the most potentially violent of all the inmates at Bridgewater, but they are also the most high-profile inmates at Bridgewater, and you begin to get high-profile inmates. This is Jesse Pomeroy. Pomeroy was the youngest person convicted of a capital crime in Massachusetts. He was convicted of murder at the age of 14. He was sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted. His sentence was commuted, and he spent his life in Charlestown State Prison. At the end of his life, seen here, he became ill and he was transferred to Bridgewater, where he died. Sacco and Vanzetti. everyone knows them. They were remanded to Bridgewater for observation in the 1920s during their trial. They were remanded separately on separate occasions. Vanzetti particularly was very bothered by this, and he challenged his attorney with that, that you need to get me out of here or I will fire you. Both of them are judged sane, and then they stand trial and are, as we all know, executed at Charlestown at the end of the decade. And then also you have Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler. He is in there. He escapes in 1967. Part of the reason for his escape, he wants to draw attention to the conditions that prevail in the prison, and we'll see what they were like in a moment. But unfortunately, his escape draws more attention to security at the prison, and it's considered lax, and there is more attention that is devoted to improving security than it is to improving conditions within the prison. Now, in addition to the criminally insane, in addition to the petty criminals that you have in there, you get a third classification that is added in 1922, and that is a classification of the defective delinquents. The defective delinquents are simply young men mostly, but there are some young girls that are sent to Bridgewater who have been convicted of a non-capital offense. Many of them are developmentally disabled, but they are sent to Bridgewater. A lot of this comes from the eugenics movement, which unfortunately was centered in Massachusetts, and there's a thought that a tendency towards crime, things such as that are hereditary, that they are based upon race, that they are based upon biological traits. And you see the rise of the eugenic movement. And Bridgewater is somewhat involved with that because Superintendent Blackstone is part of a 5-member commission in Massachusetts that looks at promoting eugenics. And you begin to see individuals incarcerated in Bridgewater. What this means is you see children incarcerated in Bridgewater, many of them for the remainder of their lives as defective delinquents, because they may have been sent there because they were convicted of a petty crime, but sometimes they're kept in there the remainder of their life because the superintendent feels it's not okay to release you back into society. Now, the inmates clearly are there against their will. This creates obvious issues for the guards and the attendants. And during this period, you see a rise in violence in the institution. Between the 1920s and the 1940s is the most serious episodes of violence against guards, and unfortunately, a number of them lose their lives in the line of duty. Now, the guards were underpaid, they were understaffed, they were undertrained. There was an effort to get them more pay, but that pay was little compensation for the violence that they needed to be aware of and potentially would face on a daily basis. In addition to increased violence in the institution, in the 1930s you get a rise in scandals at the institution. The legislature is prompted to do an investigation, and they term the administration inefficient and imprudent. And this is after a scandal where a number of State Farm workers were found taking products from the farm and products destined for the farm and selling them to individuals outside the community and pocketing the money. So by the 1930s, you begin to see in Bridgewater, and it's perceived as the worst prison in the Commonwealth. There is a lot of criticism that is leveled at Bridgewater. One politician calls it a cesspool of depravity, where hundreds of unfortunate have never been given a chance. And there's this growing perception in the 1930s that people are just put in Bridgewater because, again, they're social outcasts. We don't want them on the streets. We're going to put them in Bridgewater, but there's very little that we're going to do for them in terms of rehabilitating them. This leads to the worst level of violence that the institution will see. On New Year's Day, 1942, 14 of the defective delinquents conspired to escape. Only 3 of them do so, but the subsequent rampage that they go on, it results in the death of 3 guards. Now, by the 1930s, it's clear that Bridgewater does not have an ability to cope. There are too many classifications, there are too many things that it's trying to grapple with. Administration by the Bureau of Prisons means that they're not quite equipped to deal with folks that are in the asylum that are struggling with mental illness. So there is this perception in the 1930s that Bridgewater is not where it should be, and it is perceived, as I said, as one of the worst, if not the worst institutions in Massachusetts. This will lead to some changes, and it will lead to some folks advocating change. But before that happens, you begin to see in the 1940s that there are criticisms of people and allegations of people being committed to Bridgewater without due process. That these are folks that have never been committed of a crime, but they are being sent to Bridgewater. Maybe they were sent to one of the state hospitals where they became unruly. They became difficult to manage, so they were sent to Bridgewater. They were sent to a penal institution, yet they were never convicted of a crime. The legislature does an investigation, and ultimately in the 1950s, many inmates are released because they were not given due process. They were not convicted of a crime. They were not represented when they were tried. So there are a number of issues. And so what this does is it begins to develop a reputation and reinforce that reputation of Bridgewater as a very challenging place, and a place that is challenged, and a place that is troubled. Now, in 1955, there is a state prison riot at Charlestown. And the Commonwealth knows that based upon the issues it's having with Bridgewater, there's a need to overhaul the penal system in Massachusetts. And it does so in 1955, and at that point, Bridgewater becomes a Massachusetts correctional institution at Bridgewater. But there is little substantive change besides the name. The conditions in the prison are deplorable. You have folks living in the hospital for the criminally insane, which is here, buildings dating from 1887, and they are still living there. There's no thermostat, or there's only a single thermostat for the whole building, so the heat is unregulated. There's no running water. So the men that are incarcerated here are meant to relieve themselves in a bucket, which they are forced to handle without recourse to soap and water afterwards. They're living in inhumane conditions. Now, the Commonwealth is challenged to make advances. Because of politics, as always, there are some reformers that want to move the institution ahead. There are some that hold it behind. So it is left to outside organizations, and particularly the Boston Globe at this time, to advocate change and to call for change in the institution. Inmates, or patients rather, at Bridgewater State Hospital, many of them were not provided medical care. This is increasingly seen as a civil rights violation. In Massachusetts, you begin to develop a notion of medical treatment, of a right to medical treatment, and this also becomes a national concept during the late 1950s and the 1960s, that to deprive someone of medical treatment who is an inmate or a patient in an asylum for the criminally insane is considered a violation of civil liberties. So there are court cases that begin to push for medical treatment. The Boston Globe in the 1950s and early 1960s starts a series of exposés on men that they call forgotten men. These are people, prisoners at Bridgewater, who are incarcerated for periods of up to 30 years, who are simply convicted at one point of maybe being publicly drunk. There are instances of men being incarcerated that long for walking on railroad tracks, for taking coins out of gas meters, and they remain there for the rest of their lives. Most notable of all, the case that's usually brought up, is a gentleman named Kippy. We don't know his name, he's just known as Kippy. In 1938, he was drunk and he painted his horse to resemble a zebra. And it was probably for a marketing purpose. He was convicted of public drunkenness in 1938, and he remained in Bridgewater until 1967 when he died for that one crime. So, you begin to get this reputation in Bridgewater, which is very well known in Massachusetts, and it's very much discussed in Massachusetts. But in 1967, most of you probably have heard of Titicut Follies, you get the documentary film Titicut Follies, which goes in and explores conditions within the prison. And it becomes notorious. The film depicts various scenes, force-feeding an inmate. It depicts scenes of abuse of prisoners, and it depicts other very shocking and horrifying things. The Commonwealth bans a film, and it bans a film on the grounds that this is a gross invasion of the inmate's privacy. Many of these inmates did not sign waivers, or they did not understand the waivers that they were signing. But the filmmaker, Frederick Wiseman, says that no, the Commonwealth is simply embarrassed by the conditions that are allowed to exist in this prison. And although the film is banned in Massachusetts, it is seen outside the Commonwealth. It does generate interest and more notoriety and more investigations into the prison. The following year, in 1968, the New York Times looked at Bridgewater, and it labeled it as one of the worst institutions, if not the worst institution in the nation. This was written by a gentleman that had toured prisons throughout the country, and we see, and you see it in films, the stereotype of the Southern prison and the chain gangs. He felt that Bridgewater was worse than that. In 1981, you get the publication of this book. This is written by Thomas Ryan, who was an attendant at Bridgewater State Hospital, and he also writes of abuse of inmates that he sees by some attendants. And this attention that Bridgewater begins to see begins to drive efforts to improve Bridgewater. And so in the 1970s, you begin to get changes that are being made. Thankfully, at that point, alcoholism and homelessness are decriminalized, that they are no longer considered crimes in Massachusetts. In 1972, you also get the abolition of the defective delinquent department, which was a mistake from the very beginning, and the Commonwealth finally realized that. So you begin to get fewer of these individuals sent to Bridgewater. In 1974, you get the construction of the new Bridgewater State Hospital. So those buildings that were allowed to exist from 1887, and folks were living there up until 1984, they are now moved, or 1974 rather, they are now moved into this facility. So you begin to see positive change. And this change comes from legislative action in court orders, because there are many cases that bring conditions in the prison and conditions in the state hospital to the courts, and the court remediates this. Things seem to turn around at Bridgewater in the late 1970s and early 1980s, but in 1987 you have a string of unexplained deaths in Bridgewater State Hospital, and this again draws attention to the institution, and that attention has remained on Bridgewater ever since. Fortunately, changes are being made. Last year, there was a new program that was instituted under the Baker administration at the start of 2017, and that was to hire a new group, Correct Care Solutions, to administer Bridgewater State Hospital. The guards were moved from inside the hospital, and they now do perimeter security. It is thought now that the focus can be on rehabilitation, so rehabilitative care rather than custodial care, which Bridgewater has seen all along. Now, the question is, does any of this matter? I recently had a critic, and he said that there's nothing new in this story. There's nothing about the new Bridgewater and the new improved Bridgewater. But I would challenge that, because the past is the present and the past is the future. Our refusal to see anything new in this story is exactly what has held Bridgewater back. To give you an analogy, and I'm going to call on Bugs Bunny. You probably didn't think I could work him into this conversation, but our friend Bugs Bunny in the 1940s and the 1950s, whenever he ended up at a destination he did not intend, he would look back and he would think, where did I go wrong? And inevitably, he would come to the conclusion, I should have taken that left turn at Albuquerque. Well, we too can and we too should look back at Bridgewater's history and ask those same questions. Where did we as a Commonwealth take that wrong decision, take that wrong turn? Was it in 1854 when we opened and we built an institution to the lowest habitable standard, and we allowed those standards to be maintained up until the 1970s? Was it in 1874 when allegations of brutality and mistreatment of inmates and patients were first brought up, and we didn't keep that top of mind, that it was simply dismissed and not looked afterwards? Was it in 1919 when Bridgewater was placed under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Prisons? Was it in 1929 when advocates called for individualized medical treatment for patients at Bridgewater State Hospital, but we did nothing with that until 2017? So we need to look back and we need to ask, where did we take the wrong turn? Where could we have made a better turn? By asking those questions, that is what becomes new about this story. Bridgewater, if we ask these questions, if we look back, if we challenge the institution, we can ultimately arrive at that destination that we intended. By asking these questions and knowing the history of Bridgewater, we can ultimately get that institution to be the model institution that we once aspired to be, or once aspired to have. So that concludes my discussion for tonight. Again, thank you all for coming out to learn a little bit about the history, somewhat the dark history of Bridgewater, and I will take any questions that you might have.
You didn't have any pictures of the gift shop, did you?
I did not, but
I got things from
yep. But the good thing is they just shared with me tonight, and Shelley can probably speak to that. The Society just received a collection about 6 months ago, I believe, of a lot of historic photos of Bridgewater dating largely from the 1940s up until the 1960s.
They had a lot of things to buy. My father used to put home a lot of different little cop things. And
Yep.
You work at the prison?
yes, for 25 years. But they used to make everything, nice things.
Yep.
Talented.
Yeah, a lot of, when they were put to work in the industrial work, they were somewhat limited to doing cane seating of chairs, because in the late 1800s, labor unions, industrial workers, they saw this as competition. So the Commonwealth restricted the industrial employees to what they could make, and they began doing things like that, making crafts, and a lot of prisons did that. They began making crafts that they could sell because they did not compete with industrial labor outside the prisons. Yes, sir.
The other two institutions in the Commonwealth, Shrewsbury and Munson, do they share a similar history or,
They do. They were both challenged. Munson became an educational facility for pauper children. It later became a hospital for epileptics. Epilepsy at the time was viewed differently, not necessarily a medical issue as it is today, so they struggled with that. Tewksbury is an interesting story. That's partially how I came to this. In the 1880s, there was a tremendous scandal at Tewksbury. The governor, Benjamin Butler, who you saw a picture of, during his inaugural address, he said that there's gross nepotism at Tewksbury. The Marsh family, they occupy all the officer positions. They're stealing from the inmates. They are allowing patients to die so that they can sell the bodies to Harvard medical schools and other schools. The skin from those patients have brought the Woburn to be tanned and to make into other things. How much of it is true, it's difficult to say. The problem with that scandal at Tewksbury, even though it was supposedly to improve that institution, for instance, Anne Sullivan, Helen Keller's teacher, she was an inmate of Tewksbury for a while. She left horrifying stories of rats and things like that. So it was not a clean, healthy place. But the politicians became so busy trying to score points on one another. Butler wanted to make the Republicans look bad. The Republicans were boxed into defending Tewksbury with that. So Tewksbury was a horrifying place in the 1880s, but they eventually moved on, and then Bridgewater seemed to be the one that had the problems. Tewksbury eventually became the state hospital at Tewksbury and Munson as well too, so their roles evolved as well. Yes, sir. Thank you.
maybe a little bit off point, but no experiment with the boot camp complex down into the ground?
Yeah, I don't have much on that. The focus seems to be that as the institution moved on, a lot of the focus increasingly moved towards the state hospital. The other institutions became less and less challenged. The prison, there were conditions in the prison, but not so much the prison programs, and they did offer them. And again, the photos that the Society has, it shows a lot of those programs that they did have. So it's not to say, because this obviously is a very dark story, it's not to say that there weren't positive things that were done. And there were people that were rehabilitated through Bridgewater, but the overall picture is that it was an institution that definitely struggled.
When it was first opened, and you were referring to the residents, when it was an arms
Yep.
only,
Yep.
as inmates, why was that word used? Was that a common word at that time, but they weren't prisoners or criminals, and yet they were called inmates?
Part of it is political correctness. It was a word that was considered okay. Today we have that connotation of it's someone who has done something, someone that is convicted or incarcerated. But they essentially were treated like that. There was a lot of discussion of the inmates. A large proportion of them were Irish. There were a lot of nativist sentiments in the 1850s. Irish could not get jobs. The almshouse was their last resort. But there were conservative politicians who said, oh, they're just taking advantage of the luxury of the almshouse. I mean, when you see the image of it, and there's an image there of it, there is a fence around there. You could not leave. You couldn't just decide that, oh, I've had enough of the almshouse, I'm going to leave. There were criticisms of the vagrants that were later sentenced there because, again, some of the conservative politicians said, oh, well, the vagrants only come in the winter when they need shelter and they leave us in the spring. And you read some of the reports of the institutions and they become very angry and very bitter that there is this conception of the almshouses like a luxury grand hotel, which it was not. It was very restricted, but they were referred to as inmates, and they were essentially treated as inmates. You know, we would think today that they're residents and things like that, because the image that we have as an almshouse, it's usually the poor house, it's the poor farm, it's old folks like rocking on the porch and enjoying their twilight years, but it wasn't. Some communities it was, but particularly with the state almshouses, no. In Massachusetts, actually became a model for other institutions, the workhouse, for instance, the workhouse in Cranston, Rhode Island. Rhode Island modeled its workhouse system on Massachusetts, but it was not a pleasant place to be. Yes?
What percentage of the inmates were women?
Very few. Initially, when it was an almshouse, it was probably half and half. The second largest reason for medical care there was childbirth, actually. The first was tuberculosis, which was very high, but childbirth. So there were a lot of women when it was an almshouse. Increasingly, as it became a workhouse, less and less. Typically, you had a lot of women that would be convicted of public drunkenness, no more than men, but you would have a fair proportion. But also prostitutes would be convicted there. Eventually, what you see is actually this building is the women's prison over there. You begin to get a women's prison built. There is a time when they opened Sherborne, which is now Framingham. They opened that in the late 1800s, and they try to get the women out of there, but then they open up this prison, and it closes in the early 1900s because they felt that that was difficult to manage as well too, because now you had to have separate facilities for the women versus the men. So they did try to get the women out of there as well, and they pretty much opened Sherborne to get some of them there.
And one more question.
Sure.
Farming is seasonal work.
Yep.
What did they do during this period of time?
Yeah. Some of them still worked out in the fields because they had obviously an enormous herd of cattle, dairy cattle and things like that. So there was, but to your point, there was less of it. They would have been, you will see the indoor industrial employment. It tends to be seasonal. Yeah. And there were times when they couldn't occupy all of the individuals, and that became a problem too, because even when it was a workhouse that, okay, I need to teach all of you the habit of industry, but I don't have enough work to do that. So people became idle, and so even with that, because some folks will find that rehabilitative, that ability to work and to accomplish and to produce, sometimes the workhouse wasn't able to even offer that. Yes, sir?
For your information, prior to the prison almshouse being built, the town of Bridgewater had one located on South Street, from South Street over to Bedford Street, and 90 acres there. And it was actually, the entrance was on South Street, but opposite Cross Street. And state prisoners or state inmates or whatever was housed there, and the state thought they could do better and get more.
Yeah, and that raises a good point, because communities were obligated to provide relief to the people that could claim residence in the community. But communities were often financially strapped. They oftentimes couldn't do that. So if they could find any reason that, like, oh, you're not a resident of Bridgewater, you need to go someplace else, they would do that. So a lot of communities, again, like the asylums tried to offload some people to Bridgewater, individual communities would do that as well too, because it was more cost effective for them. If they could find a reason why they shouldn't support you, the Commonwealth will do that. So you begin to see that. So most communities did have a poor farm. They had large poor farms. Sometimes the town ran it. Sometimes they would auction it off. You will see in the late 1700s and the early 1800s a poor auction. They're auctioning off the ability or the right to have you care for the town's poor. That the lowest bidder, well, we can do it for this much per head, and the town would do that and send them there. But then there were reasons why some towns didn't want to do that, or they were trying to limit their costs. You read records from the 1800s, a lot of town records from Bridgewater, from Middleborough, and the overseers of the poor, they're doing all these chargebacks and charging other communities for a poor person from their community that is now living in our community and doing that. So it was difficult because towns were obviously financially strapped, but it was also a way to minimize that. And the unfortunate thing is it's the poor individuals that get caught in the middle of this. Yes?
Do you know why they would put, when it was an almshouse in the beginning, why they actually took the children away from their mothers and, rather than
Yeah.
allowing them to stay together?
It was just the way that it was done. There was probably some perception that these people are poor because of the parents. So it was probably felt that they would not be as poorly influenced. There could also be reasons. It was not necessarily, it's horrendous to separate a mother from her children or a dad, but also to the other folks that were in there, you see these stories about the type of women that are sometimes in there, and sometimes it's made out that the women that are in there with like the poor honest mom are prostitutes, are alcoholics, and there is a thought to remove the children away from that. That's perceived as a negative influence. But the question is what is worse, to be in with that caliber of patient or inmate, or
It was the Victorian era when the family was king. That's why I'm like questioning why they
Yep.
the
Yep.
children apart. And then of course we know today that that's going to cause more trouble.
absolutely. But also part of the perception, these folks were perceived as social outcasts, so who really cares what we do to them? And there was kind of that mindset. It wasn't as brutal as that, but it was thought that, they deserve this, that you made your way into the almshouse with that. And it was the perception of that, even though we talk about charitable, we talk about welfare, a lot of the way it was administered was cruel.
When the people were working, were they given, and they're in there for 2 years and then released, let's say, did they have any resources financially in which to start again? My
Yep.
sense is absolutely not, but.
Oh, no, absolutely. The state would give you a railroad ticket back to the community you came from. So that was it. Fortunately, at least for alcoholics, there were institutions. There were charitable institutions, largely in the cities in Boston and in Cambridge. They actually built a house. It was a charitable institution. They built it right outside the prison so that they could support alcoholics that had been released, because they understood that this is going to be a struggle for these individuals. And how do we support them? How do we integrate them back into society? How do we get them a job, for instance, after they have to tell someone that they were in Bridgewater? So these charitable institutions, they tended to do more work than the Commonwealth. And that is a true story, that the Commonwealth would simply give you a railroad ticket to leave town. Yes?
I may miss this, but when the children were taken separated from their mothers, and they kept the children there until forever?
Until the parents would be released. So it depends, because with the almshouse, there was no term necessarily on there. If they felt that a relative might come and get them released, or they might have a job or things like that, they would be released with them. The children were, I don't want to say well cared for, but they were educated there. The challenge that you have with the children is the state says it's okay to have them indentured. So they send children out and they're going to indenture them with local families. But the Commonwealth at that time didn't think that it needed to have oversight. So you get some of these children that are being indentured into families being abused or being mistreated. And this eventually comes up and the legislature says, you know what, we need to have oversight of this. So it does become a little bit better. But that's eventually why Munson becomes the educational facility for pauper children. It's felt best to remove them from this environment. Let's at least get them in a facility where it's a little bit more conducive to their development and their growth. Yes, sir.
In 1964, the second in command over there, I believe, was Johnson, a regular family here from West Bridgewater, and Problems of Democracy class was invited to a field trip over there. I close my eyes and I can still see it. Cockroaches in the kitchen. That oval room, we played basketball against some of their inmates.
Yep.
But there was still, I think they called it Shell D or something. There was someone there who was not behind a grill, but behind almost a slab with holes drilled in it, chained at the waist. Those weren't allowed to go to see it.
Yep.
I mean, this is something that stayed with me. So he must, but the guy said that he had never committed a crime, but the other institutions couldn't control him, so they hosed him down while we were there. It was one of the more traumatic things that
Yeah.
you, I mean, you got scared straight.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we lose sight of that, and these stories are not meant, and they're not as extensive. It's not like every single prisoner, but they existed. And the question is, with a liberal and enlightened Commonwealth, should they be allowed to exist? And that was a question. But they are not uncommon, these stories that you begin to see with Bridgewater and the way that people were treated. There are stories of them being stripped naked, and all they're left with is a blanket. They talk about the defective delinquents, and the Boston Globe does a piece in the 1920s, 1930s that is quite glib, and no, it's great to work on the state farm and it'll toughen you up and things like that. But then they go in and they see that these people are just sleeping on a plank of boards, that they're not giving it any opportunity, that there are instances of people being in a cage, not a cell, but a cage, and chained in there. And so you begin to get these horrifying stories. And
During that Civil War, those were very, very small states.
yep, yep,
No, before the age of medical drugs that could help some of these people. So, I mean, they really, they used to wander away in the summertime.
yep.
Police chief down there with his shotgun in the center of town, checking in the back seats of their cars.
Yep.
So it was a big part of our little community over here.
Yep. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
I grew up in Bridgewater, and I remember going there, probably first or second grade, to see the pigs and the horses,
Yep.
etc. We had fresh milk down there. I remember quite vividly having the fresh milk and going, this is disgusting, but I remember the whistle going off every time somebody escaped, and my mother would bring every kid in the neighborhood into our house. And we lived on the other side of town,
Yeah.
over towards Halifax, but my mother, you could still hear the whistle, and it was just like, get in the house, you don't know who's out.
Yep.
So the stigma of the people that were there, and it was when Salvo got out.
Yep.
She was quite concerned, and we didn't know as kids.
Right.
But we were inside for days into
Yeah. It changed dramatically. The escapes that they had when it was an almshouse and a workhouse, I mean, these were harmless individuals. A lot of them, you see these poor folks in the almshouse. There was a gentleman who was older. He just wanted to get back to his wife. So he went off to Webster or wherever, and he was there, and he was eventually caught like 3 months, 6 months later. He just wanted to be with his family. And so these are harmless individuals, but then you get the institution of the asylum for the criminally insane, and that changes things, because now you have folks that are dangerous, that are potentially violent, and they begin escaping, and that's where you see that spike in the violence in the institution after 1920. Thank you.